Good afternoon and welcome to this virtual community gathering, a show and tell in the best sense of the phrase for DPLA's new Black Women's Suffrage digital collection. Thank you for joining the celebration with us today. To ensure the Black Women's Suffrage launch webinar is truly inclusive and accessible, we are using CART to provide real-time captioning of the presentation via stream text. The link will be shared in the chat. To turn on closed captioning with Zoom, click the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please direct any questions for our panelists to the Q&A box accessible at the bottom of your screen. We will monitor the chat and speakers will answer questions at the end and also throughout the presentation. The Digital Public Library of America is a national platform providing free access to digitized collections from 4,000 libraries, archives, historical societies, and museums. DPLA amplifies the value of libraries and cultural organizations as America's most trusted sources of shared knowledge. The DPLA is an extremely helpful resource for those involved with all levels of education, whether you're a public or academic librarian, K-12 teacher, or college professor looking to use primary sources to enhance research, instruction, and lifelong learning. Offering millions of items viewable through innovative interfaces and hand-curated exhibition on topics of national interest, the DPLA can be used across many kinds of classes and to satisfy the curiosity of students and scholars. I'm Shanae Yvette Moraine, and as community manager here at DPLA, I support the network, its advisory bodies, working groups, and their promotion of DPLA's unique value while engaging the cultural heritage institutions across the country. The Black Women's Suffrage Digital Collection and cultivating sub-grant partnerships with archives and archivists of color requires acknowledging that digital endeavors are not divorced from questions of race, power, and equity. These relationships and collection development priorities must be grounded in inclusivity and consciousness of history of the injustices in libraries and archives. Here, we are working to make African American collections accessible in the DPLA and modeling how our national network can serve as a platform for repair and building reciprocal relationships. The centennial of the 19th Amendment has inspired major national public history projects around women's history. DPLA was awarded funds by Pivotal Ventures, an investment and incubation company created by Melinda Gates to support a collaborative digital collection focused on the roles and experiences of Black women in the women's suffrage movement, and more broadly, women's rights, voting rights, and civic activism between the 1850s and 1960s. This afternoon, we are launching blackwomenssuffrage.org, featuring photographs, correspondence, speeches, event programs, publications, oral histories, and other artifacts. Thank you to Pivotal for supporting this work and our designing the project so that the majority of the funds go to our partners to support new digitization and metadata remediation. This afternoon, you'll hear from Elaine L. Westbrooks, DPLA board member and vice provost of University Archives and University Librarian at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Elaine will provide opening remarks on the impact of curatorial choice. Leanne Finnegan and Penelope Schumacher from the DPLA Metadata Working Group, of which they serve as co-chairs, will spotlight the statement on potentially harmful language that has emerged from this group for the Black Women's Suffrage Digital Collection especially. Yusef Omawale, director of the Southern California Library, is joining us to talk about digitizing the Charlotta A. Bass papers. And Jasmine A. Lockwood, user experience designer, will join us to walk through her inspiration for the website's beautiful visual elements. And now to set the occasion. We are celebrating the launch today on September 8th in recognition of the date Alabama ratified the 19th Amendment in 1953 as a way to further highlight examples of under-researched moments in the suffrage movement and the history of denied and delayed rights. In the 1890s, women in Alabama began forming their own organizations to advocate for the rights of women and children. By the 1910s, groups such as the Alabama, excuse me, By the 1910s, groups such as the Alabama Equal Suffrage Association formed with the specific goal of securing women's suffrage, but many of these groups only advocated for white women's suffrage. After decades of arguments for and against the women's suffrage, the US Congress finally voted in favor of the 19th Amendment in 1919. After Congress passed the 19th Amendment, at least 36 states needed to vote in favor of it for it to become law. Despite the many organizations pushing for Alabama to ratify the 19th Amendment, the state rejected the amendment on September 22nd, 1919. Many women in Alabama supported suffrage, but the Women's Anti-Ratification League did not. Women belonging to this group thought Alabama should be more concerned about raising families than civic life. This two-sided broadside, compiled by the Southern Women's League for the rejection of the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, presents race-based arguments against the ratification of the 19th Amendment. One side reprints resolutions of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs from their convention in Tuskegee, Alabama in June 1920. The other side warns of the possible passage of 3 force bills designed to force states to enforce the 14th Amendment along with the 19th Amendment should the latter pass. It states that these bills would reverse the trend of the previous 30 years in which 14th and 15th Amendments had been allowed to rest lightly upon the South. It claims that Southern manhood would be defended, Southern manhood will defend Anglo-Saxon civilization and reject the force bills to avoid reopening the wounds of Reconstruction. Here in the digitized pamphlet from the Library of Virginia and their project Shaping the Constitution, resources from the Library of Virginia and the Library of Congress web portal, we see race, power, and curation converge. We can celebrate the document's accessibility, that's curation, but not without interrogating its presentation and its evidence of power. And then we have the contents, which explore race and racism. The Southern Women's League for the rejection of the Susan B. Anthony Amendment used the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs words against them in an effort to undermine progress, weaponizing the narratives of those in power, specifically those of the upper class white population, males, to be authoritative. In this document, we read a commentary on white men's perceptions of the rights of white women, Black women, and their analysis on the importance of voting and possibilities afforded by women's full participation in the political process. The Black Women's Suffrage Digital Collection was designed to give access to materials in a way that the stories speak for themselves without appropriation, colonization, with the goal of empowering people to learn, grow, and contribute to a diverse and better functioning society, which is the mission of DPLA. We hope that you use the collection to explore connections between the history we've been taught and the history uncovered by primary sources created by those whose direct action brought us to this moment 100 years later. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce the keynote speaker of the hour. Dorothy Berry is currently the inaugural Digital Collections Program Manager at Houghton Library, Harvard University, where she oversees both large-scale digitization and the creation of new scans serving patron research needs. Following an MLS and an MA in ethnomusicology, both from Indiana University, she has built a career focused on improving access to African-American cultural materials and primary sources relating Black history through enhanced description and improved discovery. We're extremely pleased to hear from Dorothy, given her incredible strategic leadership at the Houghton Library to ensure Black collections would be prioritized for fiscal year 21 digitization, and on account of her work with DPLA eBooks Curation course, which is a group of librarians and other information professionals who help coordinate books for inclusion in the Open eBooks initiative. Elaine Westbrooks will give us opening remarks, and then the next voice you hear will be Dorothy Berry. Elaine?
Thank you, Shanae. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to today's session, Race, Power, and Curation. We have a series of illustrious speakers and a keynote by Dorothy Berry, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from her and the other panelists. So let us accept the fact that libraries and archives have centered our collecting, preserving, curating, documenting on white and male bodies, voices, and humanity for decades as a default. As a result, deep in the archives, a Black woman's pursuit of political power has often been erased, or if it was there, it was not easily found. Libraries and archives are not neutral, and we have made curatorial choices that have effectively erased Black women, or we have, through our practices, downplayed the integral role that Black women have played in transforming the United States. It is our responsibility now to re-envision all of our practices, particularly our descriptive practices, so that whiteness is no longer the presumed default. The language and description should be inclusive and accessible, and description should not obscure collection materials that document the lives of marginalized, disenfranchised, and enslaved people. Are standards, policies, practices, and procedures ethical? Are they inclusive? Are we reinforcing white supremacy, or are we devoting our time to dismantling systems of oppression? These are the tough questions that I ask myself as a manager and leader of a major university library system. And I remain very much committed to this question and figuring out how do we do this remediation and how do we build a more inclusive record for future generations. So today, as I mentioned, thank you for joining us. You're in for a treat. And I'd like to turn it over to our keynote speaker, Dorothy Berry. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. I'm going to share slides momentarily. One moment. And for some reason it started at the back instead of at the front. Okay, great. So, sorry, one moment, please. One moment, I'm sorry, there's some issue with the screen sharing. Okay, great, I'm sorry about that. Actually, sorry, this just keeps having a problem. I'm gonna skip these slides, they're quite beautiful, but I'll go this so we can actually get the keynote going. My apologies, everyone. So I'm so glad to be speaking with the DPLA community today, and I want to begin in gratitude to DPLA community manager Shanae Yvette Marin for inviting me to give this keynote on themes of Black collections and access. I also want to thank Jason Roy, Director of Digital Library Services at University of Minnesota, without whose early mentoring I might not have pursued a career that is focused on digital access to special collections material, and who introduced me to working with DPLA. And of course, I want to give thanks to all of my amazing colleagues who have been working on contributing to this fantastic and really needful new platform. It's heartening and humbling to give a keynote opening the discussion of DPLA's new Black Women's Suffrage digital collection. This is a potent time to bring together African American primary sources, especially those related to women's political liberties. We have all been made increasingly aware in matters big and small that a lack of historical knowledge has tainted American mindsets in innumerable ways, highlighting the responsibilities held by those who mediate access to the material evidence of our shared past. I have been fortunate enough as an archivist to be able to focus on two of my favorite areas, African American Primary Sources, and Digital Discovery, from my graduate experience working at the Archives of African American Music and Culture and the Black Film Center Archive at Indiana University, to a contract position at University of Minnesota digitizing and describing African American materials for Umbra Search African American History, to my current position where I'm embarking on a new project to digitize thousands of records for slavery, abolition, emancipation, and freedom, primary sources from Houghton Library. While this work hasn't always been the bulk of my portfolio, it's been the bulk of my professional interest. I'm so grateful to be following in the footsteps of amazing Black archivists and to be in the community with inspirational peers, a ballast that has provided a necessary grounding as we are constantly inundated with violence against Black lives and minds, with superficial band-aids from institutions who are feeling suddenly bare, with a world insisting on reiterating the centuries-old message that we aren't allowed to thrive without a fight. The heaviness of the year 2020, and to be frank, the lingering heaviness of all this year's predecessors, has required for me the grounding of history. I find comfort in the lives of historical figures, not necessarily the major figures, but of unknown or underexamined people who lived rich and complex lives in times different but as challenging as our own. Those of us who work with archives and special collections have awe-inspiring access to those lives through the letters they wrote, the flyers they picked up on the street, the books they inscribed as gifts to friends. It is our great responsibility to provide access to these lives, these memories, and to not obstruct that access based on our preconceived notions of historical value. Our success in fulfilling that responsibility is tied to our ability to evaluate the structures we work within and our ability to shift course to better serve the public. I recently had the opportunity to speak on a panel for the Bibliographic Society of America, honoring the 75th anniversary of Howard University maverick librarian Dorothy Porter's Early American Negro Writings, a bibliographic study. In rereading this fantastic piece, which I recommend to everyone, I was struck by this description of Porter's process. She wrote, "Gathering the titles for the checklist on which this study is based presented interesting problems, some of which were unique as bibliographical questions. These grew out of the nature of bibliography. Since present practice does not provide for catalog entries under the color or race of author, nor as a general rule does library classification bring them together on the shelf, existing bibliographic apparatus was of little use, and the checklist had to be built up item by item, in the main by the slow process of first framing a possible list of Negro authors, and then by searching existing catalogs and collections for the published works of each name on the list." What struck me so much was that Porter's description of the extra steps and effort she had to go through in order to access and discover African American voices was how much it mirrored my own experience of identifying materials for redescription and digitization. The quote is a bit longer and maybe drier than one might usually read verbatim in a context like this, but that is such an accurate portrayal of how long and sometimes dry this discovery process can be. We are in a difficult period of sudden awareness, where archivists and special collection librarians across the country are suddenly keenly focused on the work professionals like Porter and Arturo Schomburg had been pushing for in the first half of the 20th century, let alone the generations of Black librarians and archivists who have followed them. The difficulty is, of course, both practical and emotional. There is a practical difficulty in a field deciding suddenly, through the creation of new committees, new term positions, new public statements, to completely rework and reorganize their priorities and practices. There is emotional difficulty for people in the field who have been doing this work with minimal financial and professional support, suddenly being thrust forward as prized projects. Difficulty, however, is manageable. Out of the stresses, injustices, and pains, we have a unique opportunity to invent new understandings of the possibilities of digital collections curation and of our collections themselves. We have not only become hyper-focused on the marginalization built into information science as a profession, but onto how that marginalization specifically affects the Black archivist and the Black archival researcher. Trending hashtags like hashtag Black in the Ivory, created by Black scholars Sharday M. Davis and Joy Melody Woods, and Black scholar Ashley D. Farmer's perennially relevant 2018 essay, Archiving While Black, have been instructive to the primarily white field that the issues of presumed whiteness and neutrality can rot the research process from the root, from the low staff morale of Black LIS employees documented by Katrina Davis Kendrick, to the difficulties in discovery systems, to the often active aggression felt by Black people in our reading rooms. If this paints a somewhat dire picture, then I have been successful. We are in a moment where there is an option to release statements and press releases around one-year jobs that we can smooth over next year, or we can really rethink the ways in which we create and mediate access to archival materials. Centering Black experiences in the stacks, in the reading room, and on the screen give us the opportunity to reintroduce the field and reinvent the process of discovering Black history. In this curious time, it can often feel that more Black history is available on Twitter or on HBO than in most special collections. Instagram accounts dedicated to archival photos of Black life have tens of thousands of followers, and the opening episode of a superhero-themed prestige cable show sparks national interest in Tulsa's Black Wall Street and the white supremacist violence that erupted with intent to erase. I have on occasion heard scholars and librarians lament that this historical context is directed outside the academy. But personally, I'm excited and charged by seeing popular interest in history, even if that history is sometimes presented a bit askew. What we are seeing is a huge interest in Black stories, in Black history, and the materials that have been sitting on shelves long unacknowledged by those in positions of power. This is a fantastic period in which we have an interested public, but also something that we are less accustomed to, an interested public who have a well-earned distrust of our institutions and systems. Once again, however, I think this seeming negative can be shaped into a positive lens. The distrust we hear from outside is often an amplification of marginalized voices from inside our field. Colleagues who have been shouting, "What about us?" for decades are now joined in voice with cultural critics, editorialists, and Twitter teens. The opportunity to listen, learn, and change is an amazing one, and one that we are primed to rise to. Historical contextualization has become the name of the day as pundits make claims about Black lives and Black history devoid of lineage and research in the service of erasure and violence. As custodians for primary source documents, we hold key evidence to combat racist ideologies, to flesh out the historical record, to remind everyone that Blackness is integral to American history. This is perhaps more important than ever, not only because of the present political moment, but also because of the technical advancements we've made towards discovery. We have so much possibility at hand to collaborate and create that not striving towards a curatorial process that is inclusive and representative is not the nature of the game, but now is somewhat of an active choice. In the face of my own work centering African American primary sources, I have received, thankfully rare, feedback that centering Black history is another type of equality. Why do you only do Black history? What about X, Y, and Z? Of course, the real question is, why did we get away with only white history for so very long? Reparative work that centers Black history and collections is a slow drip into the sea of white history that has been termed important and fundamental. There is a huge urge lately to turn the drip into a streaming hose. But reparative work done with sensitivity requires thought, research, understanding, and preparation and collaboration. In preparing for this keynote, in preparing for a panel, actually, a previous panel, my colleague Zakiya Collier said, the best movement work is slow movement work. And I think that is true in this case as well. The urge to rectify a history of ignoring Black lives by suddenly doing the absolute most comes from a place of guilt and coverage, not from an acknowledgement that long-term problems require long-term solutions. This is not to provide an excuse to anyone who doesn't want to get on board, but rather an invitation to learn, to value work that has been done before on the margins, to support and fund workers and projects that have been struggling to do Black history work that is only suddenly being acknowledged. All levels of special collections need to address an unwelcoming history to Black peoples and histories. But the unpredictable rise of remote research and teaching shines a spotlight on how, consciously or not, excluding Black history from our digital collections has lasting impacts on what is taught in the classroom and what scholars pursue. Remote learning has led to a focus on previously digitized material. Researchers everywhere are realizing their research trips are not going to happen. and are shifting their study to reflect the available materials. While this is a new challenge for researchers and teachers who previously had travel funding or on-site access, these access challenges have always existed for scholars without the financial or physical means to access collections. I have a clear memory of meeting with my thesis advisor in the Jacobs School of Music at Indiana University and being told that if I was working on historical ethnography, I should really find a way to go to the Billy Rose Theater Division of the NYPL and to the Schomburg Center to complete my research. There are few things I would have liked more than to go to New York and delve into box, but I had neither the financial nor the physical stores to make something like that happen. I chose to own my situation and make digital collections research an active part of my praxis, an early exposure to the difficulties and possibilities of digital research. After completing my MLS and MA, I took a 2-year grant-funded position, although we all know 2 years means more like maybe 18 months, at University of Minnesota with the huge task of identifying, describing, and digitizing thousands of African-American related materials to upload to the university's digital collections platform, which would then be harvested into DPLA and eventually into Umbra Search African-American History, University of Minnesota's digital collections, African-American collections aggregator. University of Minnesota is not a place I had particularly associated with African-American history, but as I searched through their finding aids, I was consistently greeted by more and more interesting materials. Reports from segregated USOs, photos from swimming classes in the 1940s at the YMCA in Harlem, sexual health pamphlets, and more. As the project moved forward and I became more familiar with the archivists on staff, I would get emails. "Oh, hey, Dorothy, I just came across this box full of photos of Black enlisted men from the Korean War. Dorothy, I was thinking, have you looked into the college visit records from the YMCA from trips to HBCUs? I realized how much the work of centering African-American collections was the mental reconfiguration of value. Once we acknowledge the innate value of these materials, they suddenly pop up throughout collections previously washed with a white brush. The reinvention process that needs to happen is as much within our profession as it is within acquisitions, collections, and digitization. Previous practices that ignored African-American materials have set the stage for digital humanity projects that can only pull from a white hegemonic corpus, for student papers that had limited access for primary sources, for remote teaching pedagogy that is striving for inclusion and coming up short. New interests and commitment can create new standards for digital collections, inspiring scholars to different focuses. Young Black feminists who wrote about the suffrage movement have been forced to footnote the history they wanted to foreground due to a lack of access, and now have the opportunity and perhaps more importantly, the assistance to write the histories they need, even if they don't have the funding to travel to Charleston, Oakland, or Chicago. I am invigorated in the face of adversity every time I go into the stacks and pull materials to digitize, enhancing the historical record and bringing Black history to the forefront. This current moment's work is built on foundations of scholars, archivists, librarians, aunties, pastors, scrapbookers, who have preserved and promoted Black history without support or respect. While I have more privilege than many, my career has been pocked by the spirit-crushing experiences when Black lives, be they mine, those of my colleagues, or of archival subjects, have been actively devalued. Those negative experiences, however, are drowned out by the joy I have heard from writers discovering new Black databases, the pride of colleagues presenting on their own amazing research and collections, the recognition from students who finally see themselves as the inheritors of history. Archivists have an astonishing ability to shape the history that gets written, which in turn shapes the stories that get remembered. A commitment to shaping history in all its dimensions is one we should stand by, and one that we contribute to by designing and pursuing work that Robin Hoods our treasure boxes and shares our wealth with the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dorothy, for that rousing call to action and setting 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 the work that we're doing, the Black women's suffrage, in context and what all archivists should be doing right now, but primarily advocating for archivists and archivists of color as those who can provide that key evidence and expertise as subject matter specialists. Thank you so much for sharing your work and your experience with us. Next, we will hear from members of our DPLA Metadata Working Group. Our co-chairs, Leanne Finnegan and Penelope Schumacher. Please continue to ask questions in the Q&A, and Dorothy will respond to those towards the end of our discussion. Leanne and Penelope, over to you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Dorothy. That was fantastic. As Shanae said, I'm Leanne Finnegan. I'm the co-chair of the Metadata Working Group, the DPLA Metadata Working Group. I'm also the metadata coordinator for PA Digital, which is Pennsylvania's DPLA hub, housed mostly at Temple University in Philly. I'm joined here with Penelope Schumacher, my fellow co-chair of the working group, and staff at the Ohio Digital Network. And we'll be talking to you about creating a harmful content statement for the Black Women's Suffrage collection. I'm going to give some background on it, and then Penelope's going to discuss the final product. Before we do that, I want to acknowledge everyone in the Metadata Working Group for contributing to the statement. It really was a team effort. And the final statement reflects the compassionate work of our colleagues listed here. Many of them I see are in the audience. So thank you. As DPLA prepared for the launch of the Black Women's Suffrage collection, Shanae approached the Metadata Working Group with a draft of a harmful content statement that was written by Audrey Altman, who's a developer at the DPLA. So I want to thank Audrey very much for laying the groundwork for what would become the final statement. We also want to acknowledge the staff at Temple University's Special Collection Research Center for their statement on potentially harmful language in archival description and cataloging. As a librarian at Temple myself, I'm really proud to have such thoughtful colleagues there. The values and tone conveyed in that statement inspired the work on the one that we created. So I encourage everyone to read it. It's really well put together. And finally, we want to thank Shanae for seeking our input, knowing this fit in with work we were planning to do in the future. She helped us refine the statement to be sure it aligned with the collection's content, mission, and audience. So thank you, Shanae, for seeing that this statement and the Black Women's Suffrage collection itself came to fruition. You did a wonderful job. We didn't want the statement to read like a content warning, like a traditional content warning, but one that would contextualize the collection itself and the metadata used to describe its artifacts. But we wanted to craft something with the general web user in mind. And I think many of us who work in libraries and archives or work with metadata know that knowing your audience before you explain those sorts of things is really important. We specifically wanted to be speaking to educators and students. Our goal for the statement was to explain to, again, non-library professionals or non-professionals why metadata used to describe objects in the collection, and not just the images or documents themselves, so the content, may be outdated, harmful, or offensive. We wanted to do that while also acknowledging that there's a continued need to refine our practices to reduce harm, the reparative work that Dorothy Berry spoke of before. We also wanted to acknowledge our collective responsibility as stewards and purveyors of this material. We also wanted to articulate why it is so imperative that these images and documents be made available, even if viewing some of them might be difficult. The collection exists at its core to honor Black women's contributions to the suffrage movement, and it would be both ahistorical and irresponsible to not acknowledge the racism and sexism Black women faced and continue to face today. We wanted to be sure that the distinction was clear between DPLA's values and any racist or harmful depictions and descriptions in the collection. And we wanted to give concrete examples of how professionals are addressing harmful practices, both past and present, today. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Penelope, who's going to go over what we came up with, what the final product was.
Hello, again, I'm Penelope Shoemaker. I'm at the State Library of Ohio with the Ohio Digital Network. After identifying the goals that Leanne discussed, we decided to organize the statement based on Audrey's work with an introduction to the Black Women's Suffrage collection and explain why some of the content may be harmful. And then we used FAQs to address the goals in more detail. I'm going to read the introduction as it really captures the purpose of our statement as well as the purpose of the Black Women's Suffrage collection. Materials in this collection and the language that describes them may be harmful. Libraries and archives collect material from different cultures and time periods to preserve and make available the historical record. As a result, library materials, such as those presented here, may reflect racist and misogynist views that may be harmful and difficult to view. The content featured in this collection explores the linkages between Black women's suffrage and other social causes of the 19th and early 20th century, anti-slavery, anti-lynching, education reform, and civil rights, as well as racism within the suffrage movement. These materials are presented here to recognize and celebrate the important contributions of Black women and their resiliency in the face of ongoing racism and exclusion. Again, our goal with this statement was to really go back to, we're celebrating Black women. We didn't want it just to be, there could be harmful things presented here, but the purpose of why we're preserving this history. After writing the introduction, we wrote the FAQs towards that audience of pretty much middle school students to educators, as well as the general public. We wanted to avoid using library terms and jargon so that anyone who came across this website would understand what we're talking about with this statement. We divided the statement into two sections. The first one, we wanted to explain why potentially harmful content may be found in the collection itself and why that content is important to history. For this collection in particular, the content may be addressing slavery, lynching, and other harmful acts towards people of color. And while this content is difficult to view and sometimes can be harmful, we're preserving it for that, again, that historical record to celebrate the Black women's achievement and to preserve their history. In addition, we wanted to address the potentially harmful metadata and descriptive terms that may be used on these items and materials. We wanted to explain why sometimes harmful terms are used in the metadata and descriptive process. Some of the reasons for this are that descriptions may have been written in the past with terminology that was considered acceptable at the time, and then those descriptions were just reused and reused and reused without being evaluated critically. Or sometimes librarians reuse terms that are found in the original content without thinking about whether those terms can be harmful. It might be a derogatory term on the original object, and when they're describing it, they just rewrite it without thinking about the context. We wanted to discuss that after, though some of the descriptions are harmful, that librarians and archivists are often working to solve these problems as we're examining best practices in our field, but we wanted to hint that this issue is large. Rewriting all these descriptions is going to take time. It is a field that is often historically understaffed and underfunded. It's difficult to address all the problems at once. So while librarians are working really hard, they can't fix every description quickly. But that doesn't mean that we're going to abdicate responsibility. We still think that this work is really important, and we're going to work to acknowledge and address it, even though it's going to take time. Lastly, this statement closes with an invitation to communicate with DPLA and an opportunity to provide information on how to report that harmful content. We really wanted to see this as an opportunity to connect and not just a reporting feature for that harmful content, and invite the audience to talk to DPLA and then eventually talk to perhaps the data providers that own this original material, so that it's not just you're reporting something difficult, but understand why it could be there. Or if that's a harmful description, how can we update it? And on that note, also, if you have any questions, here's our contact information, and we'd love to discuss the process for how we created this statement or discuss any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Leanne and Penelope. It was a pleasure team writing the statement with the Metadata Working Group. Thank you all for expressing great care for people, those key figures of the past and those patrons who will visit the site in the future. Now we're thrilled, just like beyond thrilled, to learn more about the Charlotta A. Bass papers from Yusef Omawali, who's the director of the Southern California Library, especially since Kamala Harris was announced as the Democratic candidate for vice president in August, and Black women's suffrage historians have been highlighting the connection between these two women on national media and all over our social media feeds. Yusef, take it away.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So we want to thank Shanae and the DPLA staff for making this possible, as well as a special shout out to Burgess Jules for encouraging us to fight for sustainability as an archive, even when erasure so often seems like the more peaceful option. As we engage with histories of Black women, I wanted to begin with a poem. My slides are not advanced. By Lucille Clifton. Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model, born in Babylon, both non-white and woman. What did I see to be except myself? I made it up here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. This project is first and foremost a celebration of the persistence of a people who were never meant to survive, an acknowledgement that our death is never a totality. But it is also a recognition that particularly Black women continue to face historical injuries that make living spaces and sovereignty seem an impossibility. As such, any work or research conducted with and for Black women must be connected to efforts at changing these conditions that leave them and their communities vulnerable to premature death. To quote Beth Ritchie, work should be in service to action, and that the beneficiaries of research findings, policy recommendations, or theoretical insights should be those most affected, in this case, Black women. To center histories of Black women's suffrage and Black women's activism is an urgent call to engage with the material and affected lived realities of Black women and Black communities in the contemporary moment. In Los Angeles County, where our archive is located, Black women have the shortest life expectancy compared to women in all other ethnic groups. Black women have the highest screening rates for hypertension and colorectal cancer. They have the highest rates of heart disease, diabetes, asthma, and arthritis. Maternal infant mortality rates are 2 to 3 times higher for Black women. Black women that have private insurance, which means they're employed, have worse outcomes than white women who receive public assistance. Better educated Black mothers have worse birth outcomes than white women who did not complete high school. Black mothers in LA County who do not smoke have worse outcomes than white women who do. And this is just health issues, to say nothing of Black women who are incarcerated for voting in today's world. The historical injuries of racism, dispossession, and other forms of violence are still borne disproportionately by Black women, queer, and non-gender conforming people. This project must inform our present. The memories of Charlotta Bass are held in communities comprised of these Black women still surviving and suffering. Her legacy still remains in the geographies of South Central Los Angeles, as well as a broader diaspora of those seeking freedom. And as we labor to recover and share the history of Bass and others, we do so with a sense of intersectionality. As Pat Parker writes, quote, "The day all the different parts of me can come along, we would have what I would call a revolution." And this recognition of subjectivity must also extend to us, curators of the collections shared on this platform. We cannot escape the ways our histories mediate meaning. I, as an able-bodied, cisgendered male with citizenship privilege, arrive here with my own structures of desire, imagination, and limited understandings. What will we make of Bass? Will we have her serve the politics of respectability, exceptionality, and relative innocence, thereby disciplining and criminalizing Black women who cannot mobilize the same cultural capital she did? Will we deny her what Audre Lorde calls, quote, the erotic, a resource that lies in a deeply female and spiritual place, firmly rooted in the power of our unexperienced or unrecognized feeling? Will we make space for her interiority, a space of silence that exists apart from relations of domination? Will we trade in her memories in this ecstatic moment of inclusion? Will we, as Jody Melamed warns, quote, put her in the service of official anti-racism, which hinders thinking about or acting against the biopolitics of global capitalism? That is, will we embrace Bass to forget Jim Crow? And here you see Clinton signing the bill to, quote, end welfare as we know it, with the embodiment of Black women next to him, legitimizing what he's doing. So to look at some of the work of Charlotta Bass, she started as editor and publisher at California Eagle in 1912, before many women in the United States could even vote, and used the paper for her activism and engagement with the local communities. This is Charlotta Bass pictured in front of the California Eagle office. And here's a record of rents and expenses that she had where she'd rent out space in the building. So part of also what we want to document and share is the labor that goes into fighting for our communities and creating change. She also exposed the revival of the Ku Klux Klan operations. In Los Angeles, Klansmen included the US attorney, the chief of police, and the sheriff. And so it raises the question of what does it mean to do this work amidst so much state-sanctioned terror? And here you can see a lynching event that also included Lena Horne, among others, and connects with the work of Ida B. Wells and other Black women, that this work exists in community. She also led a successful campaign for employment of Negro nurses at General Hospital. And so labor and wages were central to her work. And here you see a memo that from her collection, a letter that someone wrote, "Dear Mr. Anderson, Mr. Douglas has turned your letter over to me to answer. No, it is not our policy to hire colored employees or Mexican employees either. At the present time, we are in heavy production, are in taking inexperienced aircraft workers only." So this is the environment in which she was writing about these issues, struggling for labor, particularly of Black communities. And here, amidst her address book, is a note, a letter around the campaign where they're working to get Bank of America to hire Mexican-American and Black clerks and tellers, and they were relatively successful in that campaign. But hopefully, again, in this image, you can see just the interiority of her day and the amount of work that she was doing. She also led the fight against segregated and restricted housing, picture of slum housing conditions in California. So these issues were very important to her. She demanded investigation of substandard conditions and advocated for construction of public housing. And in this current moment, as people are fighting evictions and the lack of housing, this is a very important issue in terms of her work. She also fought brutality against Mexican, Negro, and other minorities in the Zoot Suit riots when police soldiers in Los Angeles were brutalizing Mexican-American, Black people in Los Angeles, and the police began to arrest the victims for the violence. The California Eagle stated that the targets of racial violence embodied the wartime resistance against fascism at home. They were in support of their community, as well as during the Sleepy Lagoon, where the officials blamed Mexican youth for the murder of a local Latino boy, rounded up several Latino Mexican-American young men, and many of them got life sentences. Charlotta Bass was on their defense committee, and this is a picture from our collection of the defendants walking out. The community rallied and organized and secured the freedom of the people who had been wrongly convicted. She also ran for city council. This is some finance committee notes, right? So the kind of work that was involved in doing fundraising for her campaign. And also important to know that it wasn't just in 1952 that suddenly she appeared as a vice presidential candidate, but that she had been running and organizing for various positions for a long time. This is a list of donors. At the top, you can see Paul Robeson donated $100 to her city council campaign in 1945. paperwork where they were tracking votes and election results. She ran for Congress to the 14th district. Here's some text of a draft of one of her speeches in which she was calling for the end of the terror of living under the threat and the fact of systemic brutality, are living under the fist of the brutal, corrupt police force, which has beaten and framed and murdered our young men, both Negro and Mexican American. Here's some materials from her presidential campaign in 1952, which we'll be putting a lot of materials related to that up onto the platform. Here's a picture of her traveling during her campaigns in a journal for a 1952 campaign for vice president. You can see all the various stops that she was making and imagine just the exhaustion of doing that, particularly just technologically at that time period, much less with racism involved in trying to travel and take care of yourself. You see the more specific schedule for her day's events. The presidential ballot for 1952 with the different parties on there. Also, again, as we talk about what is the cost of this work, particularly for Black women, one of the things that's in her collection, because of her asthma and arthritis and other issues, she had ulcers, was this from the doctor of foods to avoid and foods that were allowed. And apparently milk was good almost without limit, which seems a little suspect, but diet for arthritis, eat rich greens every day. Also regime for stomach and ulcers. And material about what to do with arthritis. And so again, that just being involved in this, much less for our communities today. It's not just a spectacle of the march or the campaign night, but the day-to-day grind of trying to sustain this work. Also the cost of surveillance and attack from state violence. This is a piece of her FBI file, which is very extensive. So she was under surveillance and labeled a communist because of her work at the time, although she was not a member of the Communist Party. This is her membership card for the NAACP. The NAACP actually tore up her membership because they were afraid of her radicalism and being associated with a communist. And unfortunately, some 60 years later, Karen Bass, and when she was a candidate for vice president in today's world, also felt the need to distance herself from local LA Black historical figures who were connected to communist politics. And so in the end, Charlotta Bass started where we begin, which is with the library and book clubs. As she retired to a different community outside of Los Angeles, she opened a community reading room. This is a flyer for the grand opening. And then you can see some of the things that they're doing, also working with children. And this is a picture of her and Paul Robeson. And I end with a part from a poem by Mary Evans. I'm a Black woman, tall as a cypress, strong, beyond all definition, still defying place and time and circumstance, assailed, impervious, indestructible. Look on me and be renewed. And that's our hope for the Charlotta Bass collection, is that we will be renewed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yusuf. That was incredible. Thank you for sharing these ephemeral documents from Charlotta Bass's interior life and her activism to fold the past into the present and demonstrate to us that we have resources for the reimagining that we're still doing today, as well in the future. So thank you so much for your presentation. Allow me 1 second to share my screen now. Here it is, the Black Women's Suffrage Digital Collection. The URL is blackwomensuffrage.org, which redirects to Black Women's Suffrage at dp.la. And we have those two URLs so that the general public can discover the .org in a general search, and then also to point to DPLA and make a natural connection between the larger DPLA project. Continuing with this ethic for care for African-American collections and building the site, we enlisted the assistance of a designer, Jasmine Lockwood, to work on the site's identity and design and the functionality of our interior pages. And it was important to me to find a Black woman to do this work, as she could exhibit, you know, the care with how we've curated the documents and create a design that is indicative of Black women's lives. So our goal with this new digital collection is to provide our visitors an easier way to learn about Black women's suffrage and to browse information based on their own interests, while also incorporating previously curated collections from the DPLA site. The new website gives direct access to DPLA's primary source sets documenting topics in Black history, including Exodusers, African American migration to the Great Plains, the Fannie Lou Hamer papers, A Raisin in the Sun, and Ida B. Wells' anti-lynching and activism. Before we get into the insular pages of the site, I'm going to invite Jasmine to join us for inspiration for the website's beautiful visual elements. Jasmine.
Thank you, Shanae. Yeah, so just wanted to go over a couple things about the site. I was very thankful to get the invitation from Shanae to work on this site, and I've definitely learned a lot from this experience. And so I worked with the team to define the scope of the project, and my primary contributions were the brand identity and a responsive web portal design for the collection that can scale from desktop to mobile. So for the logo, I wanted to make sure that the logo icon and collection title complemented one another, but also that the icon had a voice of its own and could stand alone to represent the collection. I took the B from Black Women's Suffrage and designed a female silhouette to represent Black women in the negative space so that it would read as both a B and a woman's figure. The color scheme was built around the color purple to represent suffragism. The various purples, pinks, reds, and beiges were chosen to evoke strength, a sense of empowerment, and community, as well as provide contrast to primarily Black and white imagery. The vibrant color scheme and bold typography were paired to increase readability and provide clear action items and sections of content throughout the various pages. Overall, the use of various shades of each color also symbolized the many shades of Black women and was inspired by the quote, highlighting Black women's activism is adding shades of context, which speaks to the critical role this collection plays in bringing forward under-highlighted roles of Black women leading up to and during the suffrage movements and beyond into the civil rights movement. The graphics with imagery are used to add to the narrative and focus on showcasing prominent figures and the overall experience of Black women and girls. Each page also features a different collage which uses the same shapes to have a consistent theme throughout the site and also represent building blocks that portray the wide array of efforts of Black women in strength in numbers. The collages are each meant to correlate with the content on the page and use abstract shapes to appear as people, flowers, and other symbols that represent Black women and unity. The primary goal of the overall site design is to be easy to use, easy to navigate, and to make materials more interconnected and discoverable without overwhelming users with too much information. Shana and Kat helped provide interpretive content that I was able to then design page layouts that tell an intuitive, cohesive story. The curation of the content celebrates Black women and helps fill the gap in history caused by racism and exclusion that has scattered and even discarded Black women's lived experiences and contributions to suffrage, what led up to it and what came after it in the civil rights movement. I've learned so much about Black women, voting rights, and civic engagement by helping bring this collection to life, and I focus on making the journey to discovering materials as easy and engaging as possible for scholars, journalists, activists, K-12 educators, teachers, graduate students, schools, libraries, local communities, and any others who navigate this pivotal new resource. And Michael, Kiara, and Audrey have done an amazing job getting the site up and running, and it's really been an awesome experience working with the DPLA team on this major milestone.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. The representation is important. Thank you so much for your insight and even putting together the icon, it's genius what you did with color and space. And we really thank you for your work. It was a pleasure working with you all. Jasmine's website is linked on the Black Women's Suffrage website. And we're just really happy with her work and the experience of working with her. I'll go back now to the landing page, which provides navigational direction to users. We wanted to kind of make some inferences already so that they would know what to expect and where to find it. From the landing page, visitors can toggle to read key suffrage bios, which include the women's key suffragists and the women's names along the left side of the screen. But there's also this navigation near the footer of the page that advances the bio, so a visitor could move through the site that way. And each suffrage bio also includes a pre-populated link with the women's names so that they can search what we have in the collection. So it's very intuitive. We also have this incredible timeline that myself, Kat, and historian Dr. Allison Parker did the review on to share the story of Black women's suffrage. In putting together the site, we recognized that there was no one place on the web where easy to find contextual information about the entire Black women's suffrage movement was available. So we wanted to bring those elements into DPLA's site. Giving credit where credit is due is a very important part of this project, and we wanted to highlight the work of our partners and all the work we did together to reconstruct Black women's activism. There are links to all of our sub-grant partners who will digitize more materials to later be featured on the site. We noted all of our partnerships and the funders, those who are coming, including Charlotte Mecklenburg Library and their work to highlight voting stories and Black women's suffrage during this time as a part of their Engage 2020 Look Back, Look Forward events. At the bottom of each page, we also have information about visiting DPLA and our harmful language statement, which is given its own page, along with those FAQs that Leanne and Penelope mentioned. So those folks who are not, who are not really well aware of how library collections are put together will learn that information from the Black women's suffrage site. So we want it to be an educational tool on multi-levels. On our collections page, we have featured the collections that are presently available, including the IDB Wells Barnett papers, which were graciously shared from us from the University of Chicago Library, and the papers of Mary Church Terrell and Charlotta Bass, which are going to be forthcoming. The collections page is really quite beautiful. Looking at the IDB Wells papers, a user gets a gallery style landing page for documents and photographs that have been previously digitized by the University of Chicago. And each item is labeled with metadata and appears in a separate window once you open up the site, and can be downloaded, bookmarked, and the zoom can be increased for further accessibility. And then we point back to the original host institution, as DPLA is an aggregator of content. I want to go now to our search, which drops down as a search bar on each site with a click of the magnifying glass. And let's just search for protests. As you'll see, we took great lengths to ensure that the materials that would come in from the dp.la site were going to be having specifically to do with African American history. The tech team and members of the curation team had noise cancellation parties to make sure that everything that we were pulling in was relevant. And as you'll see, we have a number of flyers, we have photographs, we have meeting minutes and transcripts, published materials, and we also have a number of news clips. And that is the Black Women's Suffrage site. This site it's not completed. It will continue to have new materials added to it, and we'll be working to update some of the design elements and focus on making it continually accessible as we update it and add new collections to it. I want to share a special thank you to our DPLA tech team led by Michael Della Bitta. Thank you to Audrey Altman, Scott Williams, Kiara Contreras, who is our new front-end developer, whose first hack is the Black Women's Suffrage site. Thank you to you all for working diligently to render Jasmine's designs for this project and your care with ensuring that both the content and the navigation were accessible. Thank you to our speakers, Dorothy, Elaine, Yusuf, Penelope, Leanne, and Jasmine, and to all of you for joining us. And now we are going to do question and answers. I see that some of these were answered. Some of our speakers went in the chat and answered these as we went. Oh, these are okay. We've got quite a few invitations to folks who want to collaborate with us. There is a question for Yusuf. Which one of the primary sources representing Charlotte Bass's life has been the most impressive for you?
There's many materials that are impressive, particularly I think the drafts of her speeches, and you can see her notes and the work that she's putting in to craft her message. But honestly, for me, it was seeing that material about like what foods to eat and not to eat, because we have two staff at the library and both of us have increasingly failing health by doing this archival work over a number of years. And so I suffer from the same thing of like, I can't have gluten, soy, dairy, et cetera. And so to kind of have that connection about what's going on, it was very helpful to see in terms of just what it means to try to sustain yourself in self-care in this work.
Thank you. Looking for another question. DPLA moderator Kat, do you see any other questions?
Yes, you have a question from Heather Martell that she would like to work on something like this for indigenous people in this country from past to present. And she's wondering how long the entire project took as it stands today.
Well, from ideation, you'll see on the partners and thank you page on the site, the concept came from Yusuf Omawale and our previous DPLA project coordinator, Samantha Gibson, who's now at the Jackie Robinson Museum in New York. And that work started around just building out the concept 2018, 2019. And now the grant project is going through 2021, which is an extended timeline to be sensitive to our COVID time and the fact that many of our partners were unable to be in the office through the spring when we had planned digitization to begin. So altogether, this is like Dorothy said, doing the work well and being attuned to the needs of our partners and designing it carefully. For this, it's a 3-year project. We're anticipating it to be a 3-year project at this point. And DPLA is also working with a consultant agency at this point to think about and also to create messaging and to build partnerships with other communities of color, not just African-American collections, that we're really wanting to work with archives and archivists of color and representing, indigenous communities, Latinx communities, and thinking through how to build websites and create partnerships with those communities as well.
Shanae, you also have a question from both Karen and an anonymous attendee. Will you be sharing this with middle and high school teachers, and will there be teaching aids attached to the site, K-12 or otherwise?
That is one of the future iterations of the site that we're working towards, developing curriculum to go along with that. That's part of the scope of the summer on social media, and how data graphics have been used to share information about protests, historical information, and just thinking about making historical information more accessible in the platforms that people are already using and they've been using all through the summer. Just staying with that kind of design, that design element. So we're looking to get back Allison Robinson, who was our speaker on the last webinar, to create sharing, and that can be used by K-12 educators. Great question. Any other questions?
Yes, Alice Campbell, Dorothy and Yusuf, this seems like a good one for you. Does anyone have any specific suggestions for how they'd like to see research with these materials benefit Black women? Any specific projects you'd love for someone to start? Dorothy or Yusuf have any input on that one? There you go, Dorothy, go ahead.
I mean, I don't have any specific projects, but I think what's really fantastic is that, I guess for me, what I think is really great is that I don't think that collections like this need to have project outcomes. I think that almost just having the materials available for people that are maybe not doing like scholarly level projects, but are just learning about their own history is, to me, one of the greatest strengths of having a collection like this made so available and in like a beautifully designed site that is very accessible to everybody because it's well designed. So to me, that's the strongest thing. I mean, I hope that people are developing great projects. And I think something I had mentioned that again links back to this is that I hope especially emerging scholars, regardless of age, but emerging scholars who want to do research on things that are more relevant to them and that have in the past maybe been steered towards things where there were more resources available will now have this as the resource that can be a foundation for your, History Day project or whatever that may be.
Yusuf, do you want to add anything on that one? Projects you'd like to see?
I would agree that I don't think it requires any particular projects or outcomes. We do hope that the material can expand people's imagination, both of how to look at the world and what is possible, so that at a time when the spectacle of police violence kind of dominates the agenda or what's supposed to be the agenda for Black communities, and the carceral logics of locking police officers up as the horizon of justice, that hopefully the work of Charlotta Bass and many others can also kind of reshift back to housing conditions, healthcare, and other things, so that we hope that it just expands our imagination about what the work looks like and what we can achieve.
Leanne and Penelope, we have a couple questions about harmful language. Could you talk about the process for identifying and rectifying harmful language?
So,
You want to take a Penelope?
yeah,
Okay,
actually, that sort of depends on DPLA as well as the original institutions that provide the metadata. We're working as the metadata working group to write best practices, but the original institutions, the libraries or archives that create these materials create the metadata, and then it's sent to DPLA. And so I don't know if DPLA has a better answer on how they want to do this in the future, but we're working on some best practices as a group, working group, but we're not doing that on the part of DPLA. Like, we're not rectifying the harmful language. Leanne, did you want to add anything to that?
I mean, other than the last part of the statement, which does invite feedback and suggestions and communication from users, people can certainly send information that way.
Shanae, do you want to add anything to that?
I'm having some connectivity issues. Can you all hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, yes. We are, as Penelope and Leanne shared, we're part of the developing of the statement is that we can use it to further define partnerships and how we operate as a network. Having this statement that, you know, forces us to come to action and move beyond best practices is work that we'll be doing throughout the rest of the year as a part of the strategic plan from 2019 that is focused on diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. And we see working with our partners to ensure that access to materials and, you know, whether that means making some things accessible, we can as a nonprofit, you know, library working in the digital space, we can work with our partners to give them the resources and the tools and define together what best practices are for takedown notices. So we're working collaboratively on that throughout the next year.
Yeah, and if I could just add to Shanae, one of the things we've talked about too is, and I think the speakers certainly brought up, is that collection strategies and the choice of what to digitize has been sort of rooted in whiteness for you know, this whole time. So there's remediating or identifying the problematic language or racist language that exists, but there's also trying to come up with a way to identify gaps in collections. And that, you know, again, because as people have said, this metadata comes from individual institutions through the DPLA hubs and to DPLA. So that's something that we would have to work on to provide best practices and tools to then sort of pass on to either hubs or the institutions that provide the metadata.
Okay, another question. Shanae, I think this one's for you. How are photos, from Mary Gordon, how are photos depicting violence handled? Are they separated or covered? And how do you handle the idea of cultural permission? The idea that some knowledge is meant to be passed on to elders specifically in some cultures. Is there any way this is done in metadata in this collection?
That is a good question. In our noise cancellation parties, we focused on discoverability, like within our inner process, and trying to highlight and pull out what materials were depicting communities of color, Black women specifically, but we did not comb through the collection so much for harm and depictions of violence. And then that's why we wanted to put the, make the harmful language statement available. I think that that's part of the work that we'll be doing going forward to comb the collection. And we were sought out by a group at the University of Arizona who's working on an indigenous copyright project related to Indigenous Americans, and we are working with them and looking forward to hearing their best practices. But currently, this is part of some of the work that the Curating the Collection has highlighted for us. So we're wanting to collaborate with those who are doing that work better than us, and who can share those resources with us. And it's a learning process, really.
I think we have time for a couple of more questions. Shanae, can you talk a little bit about the source of these collections, if they were already in DPLA or if there's private collections involved?
The materials that you all see represented in the site today have come from the larger DP.LA Digital Public Library, which includes materials from our over 4,000 contributors. And with the noise cancellation parties, we put together subject headings, geographic locations, correct names, dates, and the list of organizations to pull items from that larger DP.LA project. And then we have had the subgrants awards for our 6 subgrant partners to digitize new materials to be included in the collection. And we reached out to those 6 libraries personally and sent out a larger call for collections to our network. And in some cases, we were matched one-on-one with lists of materials in our collection from those libraries, so that we were able to, easily identify them and pull them over to Black Women's Suffrage digital collection.
It seems like this idea of a noise cancellation party is getting some interest. We have a few questions about it in the Q&A and also some discussion in the chat. Do you think you could quickly take a step back and talk about the concept and what's done at these quote unquote parties?
Sure. The noise cancellation name, I think it was the phrase was coined by myself and Audrey, and that when we had this larger query that we were pulling from the larger DPLA site, we got a lot of noise, like the term white voter in the subject field brought in over 6,000 records just from the State Library and Archives of Florida that were not at all relevant to our topic, our subject of Black women's suffrage. They were white voter rolls. We got a lot of results having to do with the US Army. Randomly, we got a lot of results from the botany department of one of our contributing institutions. We got space and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, just from the terms that we had put together that had to do with suffrage. And we thought that, we had done a great job of using what subject headings we knew and we expected would bring in results, but there was still a lot of noise. So we had to come up with a process to find things, to cull down the collection and pull things that were related to suffrage, but mostly focused on white women, or temperance movement, but weren't relevant. Like they weren't relevant geographically because they included Russia or Great Britain or Ireland. And then we had to work and built some Boolean results in our query to slim down voter registration results. And one of the ways we did that was adding and civil rights and African Americans and SNCC. And we pretty much just had regular weekly meetings. Myself, Audrey Altman, who's our developer, and Kat, who's our communications coordinator and content specialist. And we talked about, as we went through these spreadsheets that Audrey created for us and building the query, we looked for terms that were no longer used. And a lot of it was, a lot of the process made us see how important subject speciality is in, digital library work, and that we all read more histories of Black women's suffrage than we each read about 3 books. So, I had done Black women's history, African American history, and Black church archives, which were my subject specialty, but those did not prepare me for revealing some of the terms and subjects we had to find. So having those secondary sources to pull primary sources seems like it, would be in the reverse, but we did a lot of secondary subject research to pull in relevant results. There were random things we learned that, like, Jim Crow was a really popular name for horses, and we had to pull that out of the collection because it was irrelevant. There were materials that we expected to find, but there weren't so many. For example, like menstrual shows, we were expecting a lot more of those. We only found about 4 relevant items for that, and were inclined to remove them. So we were able to make a lot of choices, but we also wanted the harmful language description to invite users to, to catch and report anything that we did not do in our due diligence.
Can I ask a follow-up to that, Shanae? Is that
yes?
A turn? Someone asked in the Q&A, and Penelope did answer it. I believe the name is Maria. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, but they said whites are underexposed as subjects. And that's something that we've thought a lot about too. I mean, in a white supremacist society, whiteness is the default and is often unnamed and not sort of identified, especially in metadata. Did you come across any issues with that in the noise cancellation? Or is there anything that you sort of gleaned from that process?
I would say it was revealed to us with, like, when we had all of those white voter rolls, that we could find white people very well represented in some topics, but the focus for us really was wanting to highlight Black women's triumph and their experiences and activism from abolition all the way to contemporary voting rights and the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter. And for the purposes of this collection, not wanting to highlight necessarily like white people as instigators and aggravators to progress, like the pamphlet that I showed earlier. I was able to discover that the Black women who were organized in Tuskegee, that their pages were on the back due to really good description in the metadata. But in highlighting that, I just wanted to show how white men were, anti-progress, but keep the focus on Black women and their words. And I think that is a good explanation and example for how we curated the collection, where the items showed, white people as being agitators or segregationists. We wanted to make sure that the spin and the refocus was on Black women's work and words.
So we're a little past 2:30, but we have one more question for you, Dorothy, and this one's from Melaine Westbrooks. And she'd like to know if you have explored the use of data science or machine learning to do some of the remediation work on millions of artifacts. Is this possible?
Hi. So it's something I have really only begun to touch on as an exploration. One of the biggest issues with using machine learning for this sort of data remediation is that the machines have to be taught, and the metadata that we currently have needs that remediation work. So it's sort of a chicken egg thing of you can get the machines to change all language, but for example, something that comes up a lot, people say like, I want to take out the word Negro because that is outdated. But you can't do universal changes for Negro because Negro also is Negro. So now we're taking out things that are in Spanish. And also some things have the words in the title. It's this sort of like really detailed work that becomes complicated that we as a field are still working on figuring out how to not be so idiosyncratic about. Or maybe to be that idiosyncratic, but have that as a decision that we've made. Because even things like we were just discussing of, should we name white as a subject is a pretty hotly debated idea, right? Going to like, what are subject headings for? What is discoverability about? That sort of thing. Or even, changing offensive historical language, which sometimes makes sense, and other times maybe there's no other way to describe this material. I do a lot of work with blackface minstrelsy, and I cannot take out offensive language and still have these materials be discoverable for what they are, and that sort of thing. So I've talked to people about it, definitely, and sort of that's always the immediate roadblock, which I think probably can be overcome in the future, or maybe for specific collections, there could be really great machine learning, but this sort of mass change that would be such a time saver for all of us is kind of held up by the fact that if we were to feed them the data we have, what we would get is machines that have the same pitfalls that we currently have as humans.
I think with us being a bit over time, I'd like to close us out with the answer to Dorothy's last question. We are partnering with Charlotte Mecklenburg Library and WAFE, which is the flagship NPR news talk station in the Charlotte region, to host a third webinar conversation in October about Black women's suffrage featuring contemporary voting stories. Together, we'll explore how this partnership, rooted in the local public library, uplifts the stories of Black women, the importance of freedom of the press during uncertain times, and spotlights Charlotte Mecklenburg Library's work to collect African-American COVID-19 experiences and the photos from Black Lives Matter protests, and enrich Wikipedia articles with relevant information for and about the Charlotte Mecklenburg community. To receive updates about upcoming events, sign up for our newsletter, follow DPLA on social media, on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Thank you all for an incredibly rich discussion. I'm going to close us out kind of like Yusef did, with the words of women, meditations, of meditation on power, equitable partnerships, and access to the foundational documents of our shared history, from Charlotta Bass, whose papers will soon be featured in the collection. Charlotta Bass understood the privilege of race in archives. In her 1952 speech for a vice presidential candidate of the Progressive Party, she says, "For 40 years, I have been a working editor and publisher of the oldest Negro newspaper in the least. During those 40 years, I stood on a watchtower, watching the tide of racial hatred and bigotry rising against my people and against all people who believe the Constitution is something more than a piece of yellow paper to be shut off in a glass case in the archives, but living document, a working instrument for freedom." Thank you again for joining us, and our show and tell of the Working Instruments for Freedom in DPLA's Black Women's Suffrage collection. Visit the blackwomensuffrage.org site and share the web address with your family, your friends, and your colleagues. Thank you again, and have a great afternoon.